Now, all eyes are on Eastern Europe as Russia, as you know, is threatening to invade Ukraine. And of course, in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is under more pressure over Partygate scandals, parties at number 10 while the rest of the country was in lockdown. Let's cross to London and catch up with the former Foreign Minister of this great land, Alexander Downer. Thanks for joining us again, Alexander. Happy Australia Day over there in what some people refer to as the mother country.
You don't hear that too often anymore.
Yeah, certainly not from me, as you'd understand. Let's start with the really serious stuff. I want you to give us a bit of a background here. We know that Russia annexed Crimea not so long ago. What is it? Why is there a threat against Ukraine? What is motivating Russia to mass its troops on the border? And why would it want to get hold of Ukraine? Is it all about gas, for instance?
No. It's nothing to do with energy. It's everything to do with Russia's perception of its own security, particularly President Putin's perception of its own security. Russia wants the countries around it to be, if you like, neutral. It doesn't want to see any of the countries that border it be members of NATO or the European Union or part of the Western world. And why is that? That's because Russia is paranoid about the West and the expansion of NATO to the east towards Russia's borders. And this is a function of Russian history, a country that was invaded from the West, from, the Swedes and the Lithuanians through to Napoleon and the Germans in 2 world wars. So there's a real paranoia in Russia about the West and the threat of the West. So their worry has been that Ukraine was drifting towards the West. And of course, they've done that themselves. They invaded part of Ukraine, as you're just saying, took not just Crimea, but the Donbass as well, the eastern provinces of Ukraine out of the country. They took 13% of the population of Ukraine out of Ukraine, and that 13% was pro-Russian. So once you used to have a balance of power which was almost equal between the pro-Russian and the pro-Western political parties, but now, because they've taken the pro-Russians out and put them into Russia, the balance is very much for the pro-Western president and political parties. So, Ukraine is drifting to the West and Russia wants to try to stop it.
Yeah, so what's the most likely outcome here? Do you fear that we actually will see a conflict, or is it more likely to try and intimidate successfully Ukraine into some sort of more subservient position, some sort of more pro-Russian position?
Well, whether they'll succeed in doing the latter, I'm not sure. I don't think there'll be a war because I think the price that Russia would pay for the war would be far too high. First of all, the Ukrainians would resist a Russian invasion, although Russia is a massively more powerful country than Ukraine. But it would be a bloodbath. And so I don't think Russia would be able to occupy Ukraine for a very long period of time. But secondly, the Western sanctions, particularly the American sanctions that would be imposed on Ukraine, on Russia, if it invaded Ukraine, would be absolutely crippling for an economy which is, look, at Russia's economy is about the same size as Australia's. So they would be absolutely crippling for the country. So, this is a tough play by Russia to try to keep Ukraine from joining the West. They'll probably have a modicum of success. The Ukrainians presumably will be cautious, but it's a very crude way of dealing with an issue like that, to say the least.
Yeah, well, let's hope you're right in that we don't see conflict there. Now, bring it back to London. We know that Boris Johnson's been in strife for parties, official events at number 10 Downing Street while lockdowns have been on. Revelations in the last 48 hours of yet another one for his birthday. Yet he's toughing it out. Do you think he's going to survive as Prime Minister?
Very hard to tell. There are two things. One is there's a report being done by a senior civil servant, public servants called civil servants in the UK, called Sue Gray, and it's going to depend to some extent what her report says about these parties. Secondly, the police are now investigating the parties, and obviously they're doing that with a view to a possible possibly bringing charges against people working in 10 Downing Street. So if that happens, and if the Sue Gray report is very critical of the Prime Minister and staff in Number 10, then he might be forced to resign by his own party. But, you know, that's hypothetical. We don't really know. So he's certainly toughing it out for the time being. And the problem for the Conservative Party is they have a big majority in Parliament, but they're not quite sure who they'd replace him with. There's no obvious successor sitting there waiting to slot in to the position. So within the party, a leadership contest would be a pretty bloody political contest.
Yeah, amazing stuff. We'll keep an eye on that. Thanks a lot for joining us again, Alexander.
It's a pleasure.
Alexander Downer there again, live from London.